Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be doing a video that's been requested for quite a long time, that I've been working off quite a long time in bits and pieces, and that is finally finished. Today we are reviewing Lana Del Rey's debut poetry collection, Violet Bent Backwards Over the Grass. No preamble, we're just going to jump straight into this. So let's start with my initial thoughts from when I first sat down to make this video. I don't really know much about Lana Del Rey, I'll be honest, like as a person, I mean. I'm familiar with some of her music, I like a few songs, I definitely don't dislike her music at all. She has a few really great, catchy songs that I really like and really enjoy listening to, and I like the sound of her voice. But that said, I don't really know anything about her as a person or, you know, who she is. I don't really know. So I kind of going into this pretty blind, which is kind of what I love about good poetry, because sometimes knowing a poet's backstory can give a new perspective on a poem. Like understanding the story behind Carolyn Duffy's Little Red Cap, like the personal story behind it. That adds a whole new dimension and meaning and layer to the poem that wouldn't be there if you didn't know it, but it's still a good poem on its own without knowing the personal aspect to it. Or how, when I spoke about Halsey's poetry book, which I have right here, when I spoke about this, I didn't really know anything about Halsey, and I still enjoyed the poem Summer Fruit, but then, once my review was up, some of you guys told me that it may also be referencing, like when she had her miscarriage, and again, it adds another layer to the poem that wasn't there before, but it was still already a good poem. So, like I say, knowing the personal, like, backstory of poets and why they've written something can add a new layer, but it's not necessary. You should still be able to enjoy a poem and get something out of it without knowing that personal connection to the poet, if that makes sense. All the information you need to really enjoy a poem should be there on the page, and anything else is just extra. It's a bonus. A couple of debut collections that I kind of wanna, well, I've been wanting to recommend these for a while, and this seems as good a time as any. So a couple of debut collections that I really, really enjoyed were Jack Underwood's Happiness and Rachel Long's My Darling from the Lions. Fantastic collections, both of them. So I knew nothing about these poets going in, but once you start reading, you learn about them from the text, and you gain so much from the poems themselves. And especially Rachel, who writes a lot about race and her culture, you don't necessarily need to know her and her backstory in detail, because she tells it you all in the poem. She tells you everything you need to know, and you really feel like you get to know her and understand her, and you get this amazing insight into her life through her work. And it teaches you something, but it's still very relatable, and I just think, well, both of these actually, fantastic collections. So with that in mind, I was kind of hoping to go into Lana's book and just enjoy it as a piece of poetry and art in itself, and not as a piece of Lana Del Rey's work, you know? So first up, let's talk a little bit about the whole appearance of the book, because this is so much more than just a poetry book. It's definitely like got a whole aesthetic going on, which I can respect and I quite like. She's trying to create some kind of coherent art piece with this. It's not just words printed on a page with meaning. We need to consider kind of everything when we review this. How the book is formatted, the fonts, the layouts, the colours, the images, because there's a lot of images in here. It features paintings by Erica Lee Sears, which I think are absolutely excellent, and I love them, and they're one of my favourite parts of the book. And it also features original photography by Lana herself, which is a little hit and miss for me. Some of the photos are excellent, and some of them just don't quite hit the mark for me, which is a bit of a shame. They definitely fit the whole aesthetic of the book as a whole, but as a photographer myself, I just find some of them lacking. Some of them are lazy, some of them have no kind of technical merit to them, some of them are just a bit bland to look at, but there are a couple of really excellent photos in here, a couple of portraits in particular, but others are just lacking a little effort for me. So I know I'm kind of like always talking about books and social issues and stuff on my channel, but what many of you might not know is that I actually worked about 10 years on and off as a photographer, and I still do odd jobs here and there. Basically paid my way through uni with lots of photography jobs. Now it's mostly just something I do for fun, but I absolutely love photography. I've been doing it my entire life, pretty much. Originally with like old little hand-me-down APS and 35mm cameras, and then later with a crafty little point and shoot digital, and then building up until I have, you know, the gorgeous camera that I have today. Photography was absolutely my first love, and I think it always will be. It's always going to be a really, really important part of my life. I mean, anyone who's kind of like seen around my flat knows that I have prints of my photos everywhere. I scrapbook because I love photos. I display them constantly. It's my favourite thing to do, is go out and take photos, really. I shoot both digital and film photography, and I have this gorgeous collection of mostly very old film cameras, but a few newer ones as well. I shoot 35mm and 120 and instant film. I think my oldest camera is from around 1925, and it's beautiful and it still works, and it's my baby and I adore it. Working with film, as Lana does in this book, is fantastic because it can be so unpredictable. You have to be way more thoughtful about your shots. You know, when it comes to planning and setting them up, you really have to understand your camera inside and out, and you need to know exactly what is going to happen when you change a setting before you press that shutter button, you know? And even when you're all prepared and you're planning and you think you know what you're doing, things can still go wrong, and I kind of love that unpredictability of it. And like, sometimes you want it to go wrong. Sometimes that can be really fun. So like, I had this little Holga. There's a really cute little camera, it takes 120 film, and it's made of plastic. So it's very, very prone to light leaks. The lens is not high quality at all, and you can get all kinds of crazy distortions and things going on. And it actually just makes it really, really fun to work with, because you never know what's gonna really appear on your film when you go and get it developed, which I just think is part of the fun, you know. And other times I'll experiment with like expired film, or I'll do cross-processing, which is where you process one type of film and a different type of chemicals. So without going into too much detail, you can get all kinds of really cool effects and colours by doing that. And there's just so much fun you can have with film, and I love it. In this book, clearly for the photos, Lana is either shooting completely with film in this, or she's at least editing her photos to give them a kind of like film effect. We're talking lots of dust and scratches, lots of grain, slight blurriness, or like out of focus shots, which would suggest either like a cheaper lens or an imperfect manual focus maybe. There's lots of kind of playing around with like slightly off colours and over and under exposure in different photos, and sometimes these work really well, like especially the black and white portraits in this book are beautiful. This one, for example, like the composition, the contrast, the use of that one single light source, it's just an absolutely stunning photo, and I love this. Another one, for example, is this. I know it's not a portrait, but I love how just kind of off it all feels. Like you're looking through this doorway and there's this mirror which your eyes immediately drawn to, but there's nothing in it except this slightly like distorted view of the room. So you go down and you look at the table, and then your eyes kind of pull towards the door, and then you realize how wonky the door frame is, and then you look up and you're looking around and you have all these straight lines and none of them align, and it's very jarring, and it makes you feel quite trapped, quite claustrophobic. And it kind of makes you feel really unease and like you're not quite sure where your place is in the world, and I kind of love that. I think it's an excellent, excellent photo. There's a lot of good stuff going on in this. This next one, for example, this has beautiful lighting and interesting composition. This is just a photo that really has heart, and I love it. I think it's wonderful. But then you have others that just kind of miss the mark for me, like this one, for example, which looks like it was taken from a car window, you know, like as they're driving past or whatever, but to me it's just a bit like, bleh. Composition-wise, it's boring. There's way too much wasted space at the bottom. It just looks like it's kind of thoughtlessly snapped. The wonky horizon annoys the hell out of me. The colours are all just kind of washed out and bland. This doesn't really appeal to me, this photo, in any way. There's no real focal point. It's just all kind of meh. I mean, maybe it's like a personal memory of something. It's okay, I guess. But as an outsider, I don't really see the appeal, and I don't really think it was good enough for this book. I think maybe I'm more critical of this one than some of the others, because this is like a spontaneous shot, and that's kind of what I specialise in. So my kind of background, and I guess when I really, really fell in love with photography was by shooting gig photography and live music, and in those environments you have literally milliseconds to get your photo and to get the shot you want, and you constantly have to be prepared and be ready. You need to know your camera implicitly. You need to be able to instinctually change the settings without pulling it away from your eye and looking, and you need to understand what the lighting on stage is doing and how your camera is going to read that. You need to know, and you need to be kind of one with your camera. So as someone who kind of thrives in these kind of quick or you'll miss it environments, I don't really think, oh, well, she was shooting out of a car window quickly, is really an excuse for a poorly executed photo. If you want to pull that off, you make sure you can pull that off. I don't know, maybe I'm being harsher than most people, but because this is what I do. Other photos are just whatever, like this one. It's just kind of boring, a bit poorly executed, feels a bit lazy, thoughtless. I guess the only thing they really have going for them is the whole kind of like hipster aesthetic, because it's shot on film, but that's not really enough for me. This one again, it just looks like it's kind of lazily set up. There's nothing interesting about it. I mean, like, these kinds of shots, they're fine when you're still learning about photography and you're still kind of maybe experimenting with film. That's fine. Maybe if you're trying to document a journey for like personal reasons, that's also fine. You know, if you want to take these and chuck them in a scrapbook or something, no problems with that, all good. But when you're publishing them in a book that you want to be a full, cohesive art piece, an experience, I just don't think these photos are quite good enough, especially not compared to the others. Like, we've seen what she can do, so why is she putting these alongside them? It's a shame. I mean, that said, like, as always, if you like them, that's good too. It's just my opinion. This is just one person's view, and I'm not going to tell people they're wrong if they do like them. Just, yes, what I think. Oh god, this one. This is one of the worst photos in the book. It just does nothing for me at all. I hate it. This is like, you know when you're putting a new film in your camera and you're winding it on and then you accidentally hit the shutter? That's what this is. And it's a shame because, like I say, including these ones really undermines the quality of some of the others, which is disappointing. But this shouldn't really come as a surprise to me at this point, because it turns out this was published by Simon & Schuster. And we all know how I feel about them. Please go watch my Jake Paul video for a rant on Simon & Schuster. Actually, you know what? I'm going to insert a clip now. This book was published by Simon & Schuster, who, funnily enough, are the same people that published Gabby Hanna's poetry books. And I have to say to Simon & Schuster, what the flipping flip are you doing? You are giving book writing, publishing, all of it, just a really, really bad name. It is so clear that all of these YouTuber books are just a quick cash grab. No one works with these YouTubers to edit what they're saying or try to like put out any good kind of quality content. It's clear that they just say to this YouTuber, we'll give you X amount of money for 200 pages, write whatever you want, and then these YouTubers fill the pages with whatever crap they want. For example, hi, my name is Jake Paul, and something filler poetry, blah blah blah. And then they're handed a paycheck. Simon & Schuster put it in a pretty little package, throw a bunch of marketing behind it. They don't even need that big a budget because these people already have an established audience, and then they all make a ton of money from it. And it just gives the whole art of book writing a terrible, terrible, terrible name, because it means that all this trash is being put out there and called a published book. I'm sorry, I'm struggling, aren't I? I know, I'm sorry. Mwah. And meanwhile, actual people who care about books and writing, actual artists, people who care about their work, and people who actually care about their work and work for years, decades to hone their craft, are just ignored and never actually get published when they deserve it, far more than this crap about Jake Paul not cutting his toenails. So basically the issue with Simon Schuster is that they absolutely value quantity over quality. Clearly they're just trying to like fill pages at this point, and I just think Lana needed to work with a better editor, a better curator, and overall focus on quality over just filling pages. Hey, so future me here while I'm editing, and this is a weird little edit to put in, I can't believe I'm saying this, but it turns out, like, you know all these photos that I praised in the book and complimented and loved, they're not Lana's photos at all. Yeah, apparently they're a bunch of like archival photos and found images and stuff taken from various books and collections, and not Lana's at all, which is fine. Like, it's, as an art piece, it's okay to curate other people's work. I just feel a bit weird, like, giving her the credit for it when they weren't hers, and the ones that were hers were bad. Sorry, this is weird and rambly. I just feel a little disappointed. I don't really, yeah, it's a shame. And now with that out of the way, let's talk about the writing, the poetry itself, the content. So one of the first things that struck me is that the poems aren't just like typed on the page and printed. You know, like in a regular poetry book, you have words on a page and they're printed and you read them, and this is like a thing that this is what I'm explaining books here. Why am I doing this? Lana's book isn't like this. Basically, they're written out, like typed out on actual typewriter paper, and then some of them are kind of annotated over with scribbles and coloured pencils and all sorts of stuff. This is very clearly to add the whole like vintage hipster aesthetic, you know what I mean? Feels very early 2010s Tumblr. It does feel a little like it's more about style over substance, and I do worry that if you stripped back all the fluff, you know, take away the music from the audiobook, take away the formatting from the physical book, take out the art, take out the photos, I'm not really sure there's much left to wow you. I'm not sure that this, if it was just a regular printed poetry book, could really live up to something like this. But that's also not what she's going for, so we have to bear that in mind. That said, Halsey, she produced a very visually stunning book, but she didn't need gimmicks to make her poetry more appealing. She let it speak for itself, and mostly it absolutely worked. I still think for a celebrity poetry book, this is the best one I've read so far, absolutely. But like I say, we've already said that Lana's going for kind of more of an overall art piece, so in that respect I honestly don't mind, and if she has the quality of writing to pull it off, I think even better. Does make a few sections really difficult to read at times, but I can see why she's done it, because it does give the poetry like an overall kind of more raw and real and just rah, these are my feelings type feel. Slightly angsty, slightly emotional or over emotional, just very like word vomity, which can work, absolutely. I don't hate it at all. It's a very pretty book, I'll say that. The thing is, when you're going for this like look of making it raw and emotive and stuff, the poetry also needs to be raw and emotive and of an incredibly high quality to pull it off. You need to remember that having a first draft appearance doesn't mean the quality of your writing should be first draft level, especially not in a published book. The issue that I do have with it though is that the whole book just feels very contrived and maybe a little fake. And I know I might be crucified for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway, because it's the feelings that I have, and, you know, it's my opinion. All this stuff, right, the grainy, low-quality images, the typewriter, the handwritten pages, combine this with stuff like the author image on the back, it all feels like they're trying to be like, oh, look at this poor, struggling, starving artist just doing what she can to, you know, follow her passions and get her art out there. It feels like they're trying to tell us that, when in reality, this is a collection written and published by a multi-millionaire with a multi-billion-dollar team behind her. So, and actually, I just want to clarify what I meant there about, like, the author image on the back. So, obviously, Lana is clearly a beautiful woman, but this is not the most flattering photo of her at all. And I say this because, and this is going to sound really petty, but I have a point to this, right? Her eyeliner is applied so badly and so wonkily, and it's halfway up her eyelid. It doesn't actually come down to meet her lashes at all. It is so poorly applied, and if she was a regular person, it's not really a big deal. Not everyone has to be an expert with makeup, that's fine. And if she was just posting this on Instagram, again, it's not a big deal, whatever, it's fine. But in this context, and let me just put my little conspiracy theory hat on here, but in this context, it all just kind of feeds in to this little conspiracy theory that I have, in that she's a millionaire, and she clearly has makeup teams on hand, and she clearly has access to thousands of professional quality photos of herself, and if she doesn't like any of them, she could clearly have more taken at the drop of a hat. So it seems strange to me that you would choose this photo with poorly applied makeup that just looks like it was snapped on an iPhone over anything with good quality stuff going on. Does that make sense? And on the one hand, this might just be her being like, oh yeah, I just want to show the real me, the natural me, whatever, which I can respect. But this feels a little more like her PR team is purposefully trying to downplay how rich and successful and influential she is, rather than just show a real natural version of her. And in that sense, it just doesn't quite sit right with me. This is what I mean. It all feels very contrived. She's trying to say, look at me, I'm just a natural, normal, poor little girl. But we know that's not true, so it's hard. It doesn't feel authentic. That's what it comes down to. None of this feels authentic. It all feels very planned. That's what the issue is. There, I'm putting my finger on it. That's what it is. I'll speak about this a little bit more soon, and this whole like conspiracy that I have, and this like feeling of fakeness and whatever in more detail, especially when it comes to talk about the audiobook. Well, I have things to say. But let's just take a moment to talk about what I was saying earlier about page fillers. And it's an odd one because there's not that many poems in this book. And I've said in my critiques of a lot of books that I'd rather there were less mediocre poems. Because I've said in my reviews of many books in the past that I wish a lot of collections were shorter with higher quality poems than longer with lots of mediocre ones. And I think mostly Lana's managed it with this. Like, again, going back to I Would Leave Me If I Could, it's not the longest collection, but what's in here is pretty high quality. Same with this. She's mostly managed it. There's only actually like, I think it's 19 or something full-length poems in here, and then a few haikus. Mostly she has gone for that. But there's still a hell of a lot of filler in this book. For example, the poem Never to Heaven, she literally has a draft version on one page with a couple of little scribbled notes on it, and then the next page is a very slightly updated edited version. And it's just not that different. And this feels like an absolute waste because you don't get anything out of seeing both. The biggest differences are that the third and fourth lines have been added in, that the lines too nervous to share my innermost thoughts with you have been removed, and you see Joe has been changed to yes Joe. That's pretty much about it. There's just nothing all that different between them, and seeing both versions doesn't add a new dimension to the poem. It doesn't tell you anything interesting about her writing process. It feels like page filler, and it's a little disappointing and confusing. That said, the poem itself isn't bad, it's just the formatting choices here are bizarre. Another example of page filler are these little like throwaway lines that she just has throughout the book, which may work in a book like this if the photos accompanying them were strong enough to support them, but on spreads like this, they're not. And so this whole thing here feels like a bit of a waste. Same with pages of this, where this photo isn't as bad as some, but I don't really rate it. And then, you're only as happy as your least happy child. It just feels a bit like filler, sadly. As for the quality of her actual poems, the big ones, the fully formed poems, overall I'm quite impressed and I do quite like them and I have a lot of good things to say. There are some that are a little bit of a letdown, like Tessa DiPietro. This poem starts off really, really strong. It's got a great opening line, and then it just kind of devolves into only mildly coherent rambling. This one in particular, along with a couple of others, were a bit of a disappointment to me. So in this one, the first opening line is an excellent, excellent hook. No one ever touched me without wanting to kill me. It's strong, it's engaging, it's got a good rhythm to it. No one ever touched me without wanting to kill me. I love that. It's beautiful. I'm intrigued. I want to hear more. I want to read on. But then as you do, the rest of the poem kind of starts to devolve into sort of new age nonsense with no real substance. It's full of, she said, so I told her, and then she told me, and then followed by lines of nothing. So it reads like a stream of consciousness, but not in the good way. And we know she can do it in the good way because she does it in another poem we're going to talk about later. But in this, it just feels like she literally just sat and typed it out straight from her head and then charged people money for it. And it's just not quite good enough. Especially, again, not compared to some of the others in the book, especially when she's proved she can do it. So other than the opening line, there are very few kind of standout moments for me in this poem, which is a bit of a shame. It's just a bit bleh. I do appreciate that she has these little moments of assonance and repetition, like, the floor rising to support you, the bed that's behind you, in front of you, and above you. The key to transmission, inner intuition, hold your attention. These give it a great little bit of flow and rhythm that it kind of struggles for outside of these moments. Many sections, they just kind of flounder rather than, gently meandering and taking you through the poem. The problem I have is that while this assonance sounds really good, I don't quite understand her reason for putting it in. I don't understand its purpose. I don't understand why she chose to do this. I don't know. In general, though, this poem, it could, like I say, flow better. It could carry you through the story, but it doesn't. Even in listening to her audiobook version, there were moments that felt very stilted and very awkward and like she was stumbling over her own words. She just needed to work a little more on the rhythm and get it flowing properly, and just a few more drafts, and change the content because I don't like it. But that's just a personal preference. Like, maybe it's because I, as a skeptic, am the wrong audience for this poem, but for me, just using like shallow deepities to try and sound profound, like singleness of focus is the key to transmission, and warnings of too much energy is in front of you and above you, like that stuff just does nothing for me personally. It's all meaningless, and and ultimately it just comes across as like a little sophomoric, and it's just not my cup of tea at all. It just not a fan, really not a fan. That said, that was one of the worst ones in the book. There are others that I really, really like. For example, the title poem, Violet Bent Backwards Over the Grass, is a lovely, really simple little vignette which touches on themes of innocence versus experience, if you'll allow me to paraphrase Blake. And it's a nice reminder to be kind of like truly present in every moment, and I think, especially as a title poem, the one that everyone's going to kind of remember and go back to, I think it's a pretty decent poem. I enjoyed it. I went to a party. I came in hot. Made decisions beforehand, my mind made up. Things that would make me happy to do them or not. Each option weighed quietly, a plan for each thought. But then I walked through the door, past the open concept, and saw Violet, bent backwards over the grass, 7 years old with dandelions grasped tightly in her hands. Arched like a bridge in a fallen handstand, grinning wildly like a madman, with the exuberance that only doing nothing can bring, waiting for the fireworks to begin. And in that moment, I decided to do nothing about everything, forever. So we start with a stanza of Lana, kind of like, or the narrator, I'm assuming she's kind of, herself in this poem, hyping herself up for a party, and we get that sort of like half rhyme every second line, which personally I'd have liked to see pushed a little further and made a little more prominent. I kind of wanted these lines to flow a little bit quicker and really portray those feelings of anxiety and overthinking. So when you're like going somewhere or like, party, and you're thinking about everything and second guessing yourself constantly, and you're like, who's going to be there, what should I wear, what are you going to talk about, what are the networking opportunities, or can you just have fun here, people are going to be judging you, what will they think, should you drink or not, should you eat or not, should you even be there at all, what if you'd stayed home, like, were you really invited, did they really want you there, or is it better if you just don't go at all? I am constantly guilty of this kind of overthinking and the kind of over anxious thoughts and the planning everything out in advance and trying to be like, well, if this happens, I'll do this, and this happens, I'll do this, and if someone says this to me, I'm going to say this, and you plan out the conversations beforehand and like practice your facial expressions and stuff so you can like accurately portray how you're feeling, that kind of like typical party stuff. That kind of anxiety is what I'd like to see portrayed a little bit stronger here, and I think she definitely tried to, and she does a good job of it. And, using some of these like little half rhymes and the short, sharp lines, they definitely show that anxiety to some extent. I just wish she'd taken it a little bit further. That said, that's the weakest part of the poem. The rest of it, she pulls it back. She does good. So the rest of the poem is fantastic, and I think she captures the mood in the rest of it perfectly. So she enters the party, she walks in, and she's full of thoughts and overthinking and stress, and then just in the middle of everything, she just stops. And she sees a child, just lost in her own little moment, just enjoying herself, and it kind of changes the narrator's entire perception of this party. And we see this on paper because like her line lengths get longer, and we get these longer pauses, these inconsistent breaks and line breaks, and it's as though she's actually stopping for a moment and really considering her surroundings and taking it all in and thinking. She's no longer like, oh my god, what if, oh my god, blah, blah, blah. Like, she's kind of just being present in the moment and observing and watching and thinking, and you see her thought process slowing and changing, and you see it visually and you hear it, you know, it works. The pace slows, and we, along with the narrator and the kid in the poem, are just present in that moment. And even though the kid is technically waiting for something, she's waiting for the fireworks to start, she's still enjoying the moment of waiting, the process of waiting. She's present in that moment, and so are we. Violet bent backwards over the grass, 7 years old, with dandelions grasped tightly in her hands. And like as a kid, I used to constantly, you know, roll around on the floor and the grass and contort my body in all these ways and bend backwards and have my legs wherever, and you know, the whole thing. You know, I could sit scrunched up in a cupboard for hours and then jump out and run around like nothing had happened, and because that's what you can do with a kid and you're youthful. Now, not so much. Now, as an almost officially old person, I struggle with standing up sometimes. You should see me trying to do yoga. I'm there like grunting and moaning like, oh god, it's showing my age. Anyway, the point I'm getting at is this image of a kid bending over backwards on the grass, you know, doing half handstands or whatever. It's absolutely the image of pure youth, isn't it? You don't see adults doing that anymore, which is maybe a shame, but that's what kids do. It's just pure childlike fun and innocence and youth, and it's lovely. It's also important to talk about like the flower choices here, because they're important and very clever too. Naming the kid Violet obviously creates this image of the flower violets in our minds, and as well as having a kid bent over, you imagine like a little violet just kind of wilting over a little bit in the sun or whatever. And violets have been a symbol of innocence, but also remembrance throughout history and literature and symbolism and all that kind of thing. So calling the girl Violet, it's making her the personification of the memories of being an innocent young child, which I think is genius because it works so perfectly for this poem. And the fact she's grasping onto dandelions too. Now, dandelions are notorious for being called weeds and being destroyed, but what kid wasn't enchanted by dandelions? Like, I know I was. You know, like as an adult, people often see them as a nuisance and they're in the way and they chop them down and whatever. But as a kid, they're not. They're magical. They're bright and bold and eye-catching in this gorgeous shade of yellow. And over time, that transforms into these wonderful little fairy clocks that you can pick and blow, and you see their little seeds dancing through the air on the breeze. And it's just, dandelions are pretty magical, aren't they? So how we view something as simple as the dandelion as an adult versus a child is kind of like how we view the world, with experience versus innocence. And so that's why it's very important that this kid is grasping onto dandelions. You know, she's holding on to something that she still sees as magical and wonderful and beautiful, even if the rest of the world and the adults don't. We also have to consider as well the meaning of dandelions as, you know, in literature and symbolism and all that stuff. Because throughout the years, they have been a symbol of hope, happiness, and freedom. So the image of Violet grasping onto a dandelion is figuratively the image of innocence clinging onto hope and freedom. And I think that is pretty damn beautiful and pretty damn smart. And I love that. Now, on that high note, let's go to talk about the audiobook, because I have thoughts. Many, many thoughts. I've been listening to the audiobook version of this alongside reading it, and I really want to love it. I really, really do, because the vibe they're going for is totally my sort of thing. The background music is beautiful, and it all kind of fits with this cohesive aesthetic. It fits with the aesthetic of the book. It feels like it should work, but just something is kind of missing for me. And again, it all comes back to how it just doesn't quite feel authentic. I keep coming back to these words: inauthentic, contrived. And it's a shame. It's really frustrating. Right, so let me explain this a little more. So the audio versions of these poems have this kind of like scratchy feel to it, and it's kind of like they're trying to make you feel like you're listening to it on vinyl, except you're not, so that effect's been like added in. And the vocal recordings themselves feel poorly made, poorly recorded, poorly done. And I don't know all the technical terms because honestly I'm not an audio expert at all, but it's just not smooth, it's not really pleasant to listen to, it's just kind of tinny and scratchy in places, and it does sound like it was recorded on an iPhone in her bathroom rather than like being professionally done, which might be what they were going for, but I don't know, because like, I think trying to make it sound poorer quality than it is intentional, because it's most definitely meant to mimic the whole kind of like starving artist thing, especially back in like, God, what? The late 40s, the 50s, maybe not the 40s, you know, maybe like the kind of like the 50s, the 60s, you know, when you'd have musicians and poets and even comedians, and they'd have no money, so they'd be creating the most like intense works of art and entertaining people and like putting their soul out there in their work, but then the only way they could ever really share it around was with like bootleg recordings taken with a cheap microphone in the back of a club, or cheaply photocopied zines, or you know, anything like that. Back then it was very much about like, for a lot of those artists, it was about making art for the love of it, even when there was no money to make it and no money to be made from it. It was all about the love of the art, and that definitely created some of the most creative, beautiful, raw works of art we have. And I use art to describe all kinds of creative mediums, I guess. And I feel like this is what Lana was trying to replicate, that whole aesthetic and sound. But when we consider that this was probably recorded in her multi-million-dollar mansion or a very, very expensive studio, and she has this whole team to collab with, and all this money's been spent on it, and it's been promoted by a whole management team and marketing company, and she's making probably millions back on this, it does all feel, again, inauthentic. And I did read an article in which there was, it was going on about how originally she wanted to like self-publish this poetry, and she was going to release it for like $1, and then blah blah blah, because it was all about the love of it. But then, you know, publishers got involved and she wasn't self-publishing anymore, and then she sold it for 17 quid. God knows how much for the audiobook as well. I don't know what I spent on that. But the point is, it's hard to portray yourself as some poor little independent artist doing it for the love of it when you're not an independent artist and you're making a crap ton of money from it, you know? And the thing is, like, there are still big artists that can do this kind of more independent work today. You remember when Miley Cyrus released her Dead Pets album? That was literally just like a silly little passion project for her, but it was so full of love and kind of feelings and emotions, and I think she released the album for free or something, and that was gorgeous. Or back in 2010 when Gorillaz released The Fall, that is like the epitome of someone just doing it for the love today and using kind of what they can, because The Fall is fantastic actually. So it didn't have the big collabs that Gorillaz are known for, it didn't have the big production values, it didn't have all the fancy stuff. Basically it was just Damon Albarn, who, I love that man, obsessed. Damon Albarn sat in a hotel room on tour with his iPad making music by himself. One man, one iPad, nothing fancy, nothing special. He just wrote and recorded an entire album there by himself for fun, to experiment, to prove he could do it, just because he was enjoying it. And then at the end of it, he just released it as a free album online and told people, download it, share it around, pass it on, enjoy. And it's not a perfect album. Some of the songs clearly still need a little work or editing, or, you know, like maybe they're not quite as catchy as some of the other Gorillaz songs or something like that. Clearly the production value is not as high, but none of that matters, because you listen to that album and all you hear is just like a pure love of music and pure passion and joy from making it, and it's an absolute pleasure to listen to. It's fantastic. So it can still be done today, it's just I don't quite think this is it. Like I say, this is just lacking a little authenticity, and I think that maybe if she had recorded it all herself, including the music, and she had made it a little passion project, and she hadn't charged this much money for it and had the whole marketing team behind it and the whole publishers, then it would be different. And also I would be way more forgiving of some of the things like the poorer quality photos and the filler pages. I'd be more forgiving of that. But that's not what happened. And the music she recorded with some big producer or something, and there's all this stuff in it. Like I say, just feels inauthentic. And combine all that with the content of some of the poems, and some of the poems, certain ones, there's just an absolute disconnect with the real world and how money works. And it's so weird to me that she's writing certain lines like this and saying certain lines like this while still trying to push this whole starving artist narrative. Because, like, you know, in the poem Ringtone, she writes about how blah blah blah, her third phone. Or in Sport Cruiser, she took flying lessons on her 33rd birthday. Or the worst one for me was in Happy, in which she writes, and this is just one example of something like this in that poem, people think that I'm rich, and I am, but not how they think. I have a truck with a gold keychain in the ignition, and on the back it says, happy, joyous and free. Happy. And when I drive, I think about the last time my friends were driving with me, and how the radio was so loud that we couldn't hear the words, and so we became the music. Happy. Like, so, you are rich in the ways people think, plus more. You have ridiculous amounts of wealth, and good friends. I mean, like, am I supposed to relate to this? Because I don't. These types of poems where you're talking about, like, happiness and money and that kind of thing, they usually work because either it's someone, like, saying, oh yeah, I might live in, like, a crappy house with broken windows, but I'm rich in the ways that matter because I have a wonderful dog and a great family and blah, 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 or something like that. Or they might twist it and be like, oh yeah, I have this fancy house and nice car and money, but I don't have real friends, or I don't have a family, or I'm lonely, or something like that. And they work because they have a message and they're saying something and they can be quite relatable and there's a point to them. Whereas Lana's poem, Happy, is literally her just saying, look at all my rich people things and the rich people experiences I'm having with my rich people friends. I'm so happy. And it just feels like bragging, and I don't really care for it. I actually ended up Googling this to see if anyone else felt the same, and I found a fantastic line in a review in The Guardian, which I think sums up my feelings pretty perfectly. In Happy, she tells us people think that I'm rich, and I am, but not how they think, referring to being loved and loving freely. Loved as she may be, Del Rey is rich in the way that we think. According to Google, she's worth $30 million. And being told by a multi-millionaire poet that love is more important than money feels jarring. Sums up my thoughts perfectly. Yes, thank you, Guardian writer. To go back to the audiobook, there's also the issue with poems on the audiobook being different to poems in the physical book. And this is just kind of like very jarring. It's difficult to listen to. There are some lines missed out or added in or moved around, and it's hard because I was trying to I'd already read the book, and then I listened to the audiobook, and as I listened to that, I was trying to read along with some of the poems, and it's difficult, it's hard, and it throws you off. And clearly one of these versions is a work in progress, but which one? The book or the audiobook? Which is the draft? Paradise is Very Fragile is a poem in which I tried to read along as I listened to the audiobook, and I found it so riddled with minor differences that it just became distracting, and I couldn't concentrate on the content of the poem itself at first. And it's frustrating because syntax is so crucial to meaning in poetry, and how am I supposed to figure out what she means and what she's trying to say if she doesn't even know how she's trying to say it? That said, if we just kind of read the poem, Paradise is Very Fragile, on the whole, I quite liked it, you know? A little bit cliche in places, but pretty decent poem, to be honest. I enjoyed that she had this mix in here of like biblical imagery along with kind of natural disasters and natural events, and contrasting big macro political issues with kind of more micro scale social commentary. I felt that worked quite well. I kind of liked it, I didn't hate it. You know, for example, in one stanza she writes, our leader is a megalomaniac, and we've seen that before, but never because it was what the country deserved. And then slightly later on, in my own mind I was born with a little bit of paradise. I was lucky in that way, not like my husband who was born and raised in hell. And I think it works, I think it's pretty decent, I think she has something to say, and yeah, it's interesting. Another poem which I really liked, which definitely stood out to me, was LA, Who Am I to Love You? And a quick Google search told me that this was pretty much like the big poem that she used to promote this book, and I can see why. Because arguably, it is the best in the book, and I think it's the most Lana poem in here, from what I can tell of her. was very reminiscent of what I know of the rest of her music. You know, it felt very, very her, very... It was the most authentic poem in the book, absolutely. This is essentially a love poem to the city of LA, but not exactly like a gushing, mushy love poem, more of like a poem that acknowledges the many flaws of all involved, but there's still love there anyway. And it's a poem about longing for acceptance and trying to find home despite everything, and weirdly it also kind of slightly reminds me of an abusive relationship and Lana begging for attention and acceptance from this big city, this partner, this being she loves, even though she knows she's probably never going to get it. I found it very interesting, and it kind of made me feel some things, you know? I really love how throughout the poem, though, she personifies the city as a whole and makes it into this actual character who she addresses directly throughout the poem. And I really, really like the rambling stream of consciousness style in this poem. Here it works so well, and this is what I was saying earlier. This is it done well, whereas the Tessa DiPietro poem, not done so well. And there's a vast difference in, I guess, execution, if that makes sense. So, like in this poem, it works, and you actually get this sense of her being this like lost little girl, crying out, begging, looking for someone or something or somewhere, just wanting acceptance. There's this like consistent repetition of her asking questions directly to LA at various points in the poem. So a couple of examples. LA, I'm from nowhere, who am I to love you? LA, I've got nothing, who am I to love you? LA, I'm pathetic, but so are you. Can I come home now? LA, I know I'm bad, but I've nowhere else to go. Can I come home now? I'm lonely, LA. Can I come home now? And so, repeating this at various different points throughout the poem, it shows this real, very raw feeling of longing and desire. And this isn't just a whim. This is something that she actually really, really wants and has thought about over and over. It's a very, very real feeling. It's like how, kind of like I was saying, it's how you feel when you love someone who doesn't want you, or that you know you'll never be enough for. And it's like in this poem, LA has all these people, all these options. So who is she to love it when there's so many other people who do as well? And there's so many that the city probably loves more than her. You know, why should she ever be any different or special? And it's a good point, why should she? But she still wants it, and she still wants it to want her. You know, asking, can I come home now? Over and over. It's like saying, I want you, you're right for me. Please just accept me and tell me that I'm right for you. So that kind of hit me hard. I also like that she doesn't just talk about like what the city can do for her, but what she can do for the city. That's something that I think is quite new when it comes to writing a poem like this that's essentially like a love poem to a place. I thought this was kind of original and nice, and you know, she's talking about the city like it's a friend, family, like they support each other, it's not just a one-sided thing. So lines like, I never had a mother. Will you let me make the sun my own now and the ocean my son? I'm quite good at tending to things despite my upbringing. Can I raise your mountains? I promise to keep them greener, make them my daughters, teach them about fires, warn them about water. And so she wants so bad for it to be this like mutual thing. She's almost like begging, saying, look at all these things I can do for you. I want you to want me. I need you to want me. It's desperate. Like I say, it's almost like begging an abusive partner, saying, look, I can do all these things for you. I will do all these things for you. I want you. I love you. Please accept me. And that's actually quite interesting that it made me think of that, especially when you consider her line about why she's currently elsewhere. I picked San Francisco because the man who doesn't love me lives there. Kind of seems like this is a pattern of behaviour for her, constantly following around people who she needs but who don't want her. And again, kind of relatable. And then right at the end, she tries to make it as easy as possible to be accepted by this person, this partner, LA, whatever, saying, so either way, I'll fit in just fine. So it's kind of like she's, almost like she's giving up a little bit, you know? She's just asking for this basic level of being treated as human. She just wants to fit in. Like, she's saying she's okay with not thriving, not being wanted or loved and cared for. She just wants to fit in. She'll accept the bare minimum. It kind of feels a little bit like giving up a little bit to me. I don't know. Yeah, she goes on to say, so either way, I'll fit in just fine. So just love me by doing nothing, except for perhaps by not shaking the county line. Like, literally all she's asking is that it doesn't put her life in danger. Again, like, asking for the bare minimum. I'm yours if you'll have me, quietly or loudly. Sincerely your daughter. Regardless, you're mine. And again, this one hit me kind of personally because I felt this way about people and places before, and yeah, it's a lot, and it takes a lot of working on yourself to realise that you actually deserve a hell of a lot better than this. So, yeah, I think this poem's pretty great. Decent. Good job. I enjoyed it. And I want to finish quickly with a note about the last 20 or so pages of this book, which are filled with haikus, because, no, actually, the last few pages of this book are blank, but the ones before them are filled with haikus. And they're pretty hit and miss, and some photos as well. But they're pretty hit and miss. So haikus are the most deceptively simple form of poetry. They're short, and most people think they just have one rule. 3 lines, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. But, like I say, it's deceptive. They're far more complicated than that, especially traditional haikus. So, no, I'm no haiku expert. I just have like a base level of knowledge of them, basically. So if you want to feel like, if you know more, feel free to expand on my points in the comments. Please do. Basically, haikus originate from Japan, and they were originally just like the first stanza in much longer poems, but over time they kind of broke away. And around the 1800s, Japanese poets started experimenting with more Western styles of poetry, and Western poets adopted and adapted the haiku, and it became more common to write haikus in English and so on. And there's slight differences in the linguistic rules between like Japanese and English haikus, because obviously the languages are different, but the core values of what make a haiku so special, they've kind of remained and grown and developed. And these are the things I think a lot of people don't really think about when they're writing haikus. They just hear about the syllables and think that's it. But generally speaking, haikus focus on juxtaposing asymmetric ideas, which means contrasting 2 vastly different things in this very short poem to portray a deep or profound message, which is incredibly challenging to do in so few lines and so few syllables, and which is why when the people who can pull it off do, it's so impressive. There's other common features. For example, they often focus on nature. They often describe a scene rather than explicitly telling us a story or giving us an explanation or describing feelings. There's usually no or little punctuation. They don't usually use rhyme, and interestingly, they tend to avoid using any kind of figurative language or typical poetic techniques, which is interesting. They're incredibly restrictive, and so creating something beautiful and with meaning and purpose in that very restrictive form is incredibly difficult. Anyone can write a haiku, but very few people can write a good one. Lana's are of varying quality. So one that I really liked was this: You in the Soft Light, the 405 from Venice, a river of red. And this one's pretty much perfect. It's not about nature, but it talks about being in an urban setting in the same way you would talk about nature in a haiku. I think that's really cool. We get the setting in the middle, which situates our little scene, and then the first and final lines, we have the real contrast in terms of lighting. So in the first line, she's looking at a person, and she sees them bathed in this soft light, in comparison to the road itself in the last line, which has this like traffic racing down it so fast that it looks like a river of red. And I love that image. It reminds me of taking long exposure photos of like cars driving past, and so it's just so vivid, and it makes you feel quite small and insignificant, and it reminds you that there's like a whole world out there passing you by constantly. All these other people are out there living their own lives with their own stories, and most of them are completely oblivious to you, and they're just passing by in this river, and you'll never know them, never meet them, they'll never know you. And you know, it's contrasting this big, busy, harsh outside world with this soft, calm, inner, private world where she just looks at one single person in a soft light. And I think it's lovely, and as a haiku, it just works very well, and it's very nice, and I like this. Others for me just missed the mark, like this one. Open the front door. Hello, I say to no one. I know no one's home. This just falls a little flat for me. Doesn't really do any of the things that make a haiku special. It just kind of over-explains the point. It is about a moment in time, but it could describe it better. There's no real juxtaposition in this. There's nothing really interesting. It's just a bit meh, which is a shame. So yeah, up and down, which is honestly how I describe this whole book. It's kind of up and down. So, I know this has been long. Sorry, I'm talking, my voice is going a bit. Okay, in conclusion, If you're a big fan of Lana Del Rey as a person and as an artist, I think you will love this book, absolutely. I think if you're looking for a book that's a semi-decent art piece, then I think you'll get some enjoyment out of it. You know, it's quite lovely in places. Some of the photography is beautiful, the paintings are beautiful, some of the poems are beautiful. But if you're just into poetry and you don't really know who Lana is, then I think there are other books I would recommend to you before this one. So overall, it's okay. I also think, and this is maybe a bit of a weird note, but I think for a lot of it, you have to be American to appreciate some of the references, and maybe that's why I didn't connect with it in certain ways. I don't know. Like, I absolutely adore reading poetry from other cultures because it's such an intimate insight into other people's lives and you learn so much. But in contrast to other poets and other books of poetry from different cultures, this book just felt a little alienating in comparison, which is kind of interesting because the UK and America aren't necessarily that different in terms of cultures. I mean, there's some big differences, but they're not that different. So to feel so kind of alienated by parts of this was odd, whereas I've read books by poets from places with vastly different cultures like Pakistan or Guyana, and you still feel connected, you still understand it, you still feel part of their world, you feel drawn in, you feel, you learn from them. And this book just doesn't quite have that. There was a little bit of a disconnect there. So I think, again, American viewers, you're probably going to get a lot more out of this than anyone else. But that's just something to consider. Anyway, there are all my notes. There are all my thoughts. It's okay. If you do want to check out this book for yourself, then I'll leave a link down in the description below and you can go check it out. It will be an affiliate link, so if you buy it or anything from following that link, it just helps support me and my channel and my work and helps me keep making videos like this, which is always really nice, so thank you. Other than that, I'll leave links to my poetry playlist so you can go see me review lots of other poetry books and talk about poetry and why I love it and get some book recommendations and stuff there as well. But for now, I think this is where I'm going to end this. I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comment about what you thought of this book, if you've read it yourself, or if you're planning to go out and buy it and read it now. And also let me know what you think about the audiobook version versus the physical version if you've experienced either or both of those, because I'm very, very keen to hear what other people think. But for now, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you guys a hell of a lot, and I'll see you again very, very soon.